Hello and welcome back to the Beyond the Best podcast, the podcast that looks into the world of elite athletes and what goes behind getting them to the level that they're at today. Today's episode is the returning part of last week's episode. This is the conversation around men and women in sport. Last week we really delved into the impact media has on the perception of women and men in the sporting world and its effect on the interest it has in sport and how we as a society perceive men and women, and potentially whether our historical views or the media having historical views has subconsciously moulded our mindset as to our opinions on watching men and women play sport. It was a long conversation and I didn't want to overdo it, so I broke it up. So here is part 2, and we're going to look into a few more areas where men and women seem to have a really big difference in the world of sport. Before I get into this though, I do feel like since my last podcast, I feel like I want to clarify further what I've said. I think when I was talking about it, it's very easy to fixate on one example, but after listening to it, I think I realised that actually the biggest disparities between men and women sports is the team sports. I think men and women do seem to be a lot closer together in terms of popularity or even coverage of individual athlete sports. The likes of athletics, for example, is a really big one. And whilst athletics doesn't get a lot of coverage, and I think that's a whole new podcast topic on its own, I do think the coverage that you do get, there does seem to be a balanced amount of coverage depending on men and women. I don't necessarily think that changes the style of reporting that we mentioned in the last podcast, but I think the biggest issue is men and women team sports. I had a comment following my last podcast where there was mention of the statistic in which the amount of hours viewed of the Women's World Cup was about a quarter of what the total hours viewed of men's football. But what I didn't consider in that, even though the view time was a lot less than the men, it still broke the record for the amount of hours of view time of a women's football. So that, I think, is something that we should take away because it kind of answers the question I asked last week about how do we prove that there is an interest if the numbers are still less than what the men's sports are showing. And I think that is it for itself. The media need to see that there is an interest because records are being broken and it is increasing. So maybe they should give a little bit as well to see if the numbers can continue increasing as they increase their coverage and it becomes a bit more balanced between the men and women's sports. I think only then once they do that can you see if the interest is going to grow or if it is actually just standstill and the media coverage only needs to increase a little bit to meet the proportion of interest in society as a whole. So I was really happy with that comment. I keep them coming because I love being questioned about my viewpoints and thought processes because we're only human and we only really know what we've experienced or know to look out for in research. And I love seeing how other people view it and forming a more informed argument or opinion on that. So thank you so much for that. And I look forward to seeing what everyone else has to say. Let's start the episode on the conversation between men and women in sport. Another significant issue, another big disparity between men and women in sport is sponsorship. I could not believe this statistic when I read it. In 2021, a study was conducted to sort of see how much sponsorship men and women are getting. 0.4% of the sponsorship awarded in 2021 went to women. 0.4%. Okay, if we go back and we use that football analogy where supposedly there's a quarter of interest in women's sports for the men's sport, they're not getting a quarter of the sponsorships. Let's break that down a little bit as to why that might be the case. What is a sponsorship? A sponsorship is effectively a business deal which is purely marketing. On the whole, a business will financially support an athlete in return for their partnership and promotion on their own channels. If it's clothes, they wear them about. So in the media, they'll only ever be seen in a brand. And it's kind of like a human advert. We all know that. I think it's very important to understand this when we look at why women get less sponsorship. The whole point of a sponsorship is the money invested in that athlete is it will come back and more so. So it is purely about profit and making more money. So if there is an exposure issue in sport in which women do not have the airtime like the men do, why would a business invest money in them when they can make more money off a man? I touched on this in last week's episode about business sense. And I guess, unfortunately, it does come up in a lot of areas of sport because sport is a business. Unfortunately, I think there's also an argument to make that a male on the whole has a lot more of a performance brand than a female does. If you look at Nike, for example, if you had Tiger Woods on the face of one of their campaigns, whatever he was promoting, you would look at Tiger Woods and think, an amazing golfer. And then you might think, oh, Nike associated with that, like that's how it works in your brain. Only once you've done that may you start thinking about everything else he's done outside of his golfing career that you can have your opinions on. But it won't really affect your thought processes about the fact that Nike have partnered with Tiger Woods and you just think, great performance person aligned with this brand, they must have good performance kit. If you then had another campaign and Serena Williams was the face of it, tell me one of your first thoughts about what you see on that campaign isn't appearance related. And I genuinely think society has kind of got this skewed way of looking. And I've kind of already mentioned this, and it is about women do have an appearance problem when it comes to media, where no matter what they've done, how they look kind of matters more. And if they don't fit within a certain image, they're much more quickly disposed of. What I'm talking about is a brand, is the fact that business is selling something, they're going to want someone who can sell their product because what they are associated with will directly impact the sale of their product. And I think with a male, you're much more likely to get that because a female, there is going to be a majority of the population, I think, if they don't like what they see on the woman, for example, that is going to affect their likelihood to buy the product. If they think that, say Serena Williams was wearing a sports bra and some leggings, if they think that they don't look as good on Serena Williams as they want them to, they won't buy them because they'll be like, I don't want to look like that. Rather than going, I want to buy them because I want to be like Serena Williams, which is what they would do is if they saw it as a man. I don't like that. It's not something that I don't think's fair, but again, life's not fair. Like, I do think sometimes you do have to deal with it, but I think you have to sort of just get on with it and understand the situation. But likewise, if there is no immediate change happening to change this, how we view adverts with men and women, can you really blame a business for wanting to go and sponsor men more than women because it makes more business sense, because they are more likely to get a bigger return on their investment because they know the man will directly contribute to the sale of their product because of their sporting achievements, whereas the woman, there will be a group of people who do not see looks. There will be a much bigger group of people, in my opinion, who will subconsciously decide whether they like the look of what she is wearing as to whether she's going to buy the product. And as a business, that's a much bigger risk. And then on top of that, Serena Williams is probably a bit of a big example because she's obviously huge, but women athletes do not have the reach of an audience as the male athletes on a whole. So then they have that risk on top, saying we've got to invest pretty much the same in the athlete. We're going to get a bigger risk on as to whether it's actually going to sell the product as well as a man, and they're going to reach less audience. It goes back to saying if you remove the gender out of it and you have two sales techniques and you know one is much riskier than the other, which one are you going to go for? I think that's why that statistic exists. I think to reduce the risk, I think the investment is less. So the amount of money that going into women's sponsorship is just so much less than the men ones, because the men are just so much more risk averse, because the male sponsorships are just so much more certain. Like I mentioned in last week's podcast about it always being men versus women, again, I think we need to bring back the conversation about it being men versus men, in the sense that, yes, men get better and more sponsorship than women, but there are so many male athletes who are at a very high level. The competition to secure the sponsorship is even greater than what a woman faces. They struggle to even get the sponsorship, but I think if they're in a position where they are sponsorship worthy, I think there are a lot of men at the same level and possess the right criteria for the sponsorship. There's too many men for the amount of sponsorships that are available. So whilst a lot of women potentially can get sponsored for being good at their sport and, I hate to say it, but potentially be getting a sponsorship to meet a criteria, if they're going to get it, they'll get it. But I think with a male, if they were just as good as that woman, I don't think it's enough. I think you need to be unbelievably good, if not one of the best. So maybe it is actually just as hard to get a sponsorship as a male as it is a woman, because you need to be better than that woman to get the sponsorship. I hope that makes sense. That comes with a lot of pressure, and actually you are suddenly very disposable, and if you have made it to being the best, you have to maintain that in order to keep your sponsorship. And it is very well known that sponsorship is the reason a lot of athletes can continue doing what they do. A lot of their income comes from brand deals and sponsorship, and this is when you're not playing the sports with £100,000 a week salaries. But a lot of people who are professional athletes where their physical sport does not pay them a lot, but being good gets the sponsorships that creates their livelihood and their income effectively. So as a male athlete, and to be the best you're literally the only person, but in order to have competition you need lots of people around to compete against, and these people need to be able to be financially stable and secure to be able to do that. But if the sponsorships are only really going to the top level people, at what point do these men drop off and you've sort of removed the pool of competition amongst the male athletes because the funding just isn't there? And even when you are there, the pressure to maintain that is unbelievable, knowing that if you don't perform how a sponsor wants you to, you could be removed instantly and you've lost your livelihood. And then how do you compete in the sport? So it's, once you've got that sponsorship, it's great and it's obviously very good. How much does that pressure to continue being good come from the fact that you don't want to lose out financially and you can't afford to lose out financially? Or is it from the drive to just want to be the best? Money is a big thing. It keeps the world turning round. And if you don't have it, you can't do a lot of things. And to a lot of people, they wouldn't be able to continue their sport. I feel for the men in the sense of, okay, it might be easier for a male to get the money, but it's so easy for it to just be taken away for someone just to become that bit better than you. Whereas I don't think women have that as much. Again, prove me wrong, but I think if they've got the sponsorship, I just don't think the pressure to maintain the best is there. I think you've got to think about it, and I think it's an important thing to consider, because it just isn't as easy for men as it potentially sounds when you say women find it harder to get sponsorship. They do, but also like every single man doesn't find it easy. There's just a few men that absolutely dominate the sponsorship world. Another one I have found very interesting and I've seen a lot over the last few years is actually training and coaching. As I've said many times, men and women are different, and that is not necessarily just the physical and biological aspects. The way men and women take in information and then act on that is very different. But how much do coaches or even training techniques and methodologies take into consideration this fact? I think it almost is a bit like, this is what you need to do, so this is how it is. And actually, if a coach is to deliver information, they deliver it how they want to, based on their experience or just who they are. And obviously they use data as well to influence their decisions on what plans they're going to create. If you were to write a how-to book on how to be really good at a certain sport, honestly, would you write the differences and what you'd need to do for a man and a woman? Because you do have to understand that a woman goes through cycles every single month that affects all different biological functions that will allow them to train better at certain areas and not as effectively at other times of the month. How many training programs genuinely would consider this? And is it kind of something that we're just sort of told to just deal with, and we just deal with that and don't moan about it because you don't want to be seen as someone that moans about that sort of thing? But if it's physically making a difference, should it be a consideration? And actually, should it be a bit more well spoken about that a man doing one sport and a woman doing the same sport are going to have two different training programs to make sure that their bodies perform optimally? I'm not just saying this about women as well. Like, men have much higher testosterone. They have things women don't have, that if they're not manipulated in the right way can be detrimental to the male. So I'm not saying, oh, everything's made for a man and then and women don't get it. It's actually, are these plans actually, on training methodologies, and when all this research is done, do they consider the differences between a male and a female and then apply that to the research and then the results? Or do we just look at it from a completely physical point of view and going, the body does this at this point in time? For example, I do my undergrad is in sports science. So any research in the lab that we did, it would be on either a group of males, group of females, and then we'd test for X amount of weeks, and then we'd retest after a certain period of time and then sort of get our results. It never ever, from my experience, took in the fact, oh, it's a female, so she would have been feeling this, and this, or it was a male, so they would have been dealing with this, and this. It was very much like the muscle did this as a result of this. Are we missing out because of not fully accepting that men and women will perform differently because of their bodies? Are we missing out on even better performance for both genders because we're just missing a next level tier of research? I just think it's very important to not think one size fits all when it comes to training, and how much of the, I guess, hormonal, because I think that is one of the key things that does change between a man and a woman. How much is that actually used to alter training plans to make them better for the athlete? Because again, yes, you can say it's a man and a woman thing, but then it becomes even more of an individual thing. Like, you do testing for strength testing and then improving in X amount of time, and you do all of that, but do you do like the deep level tests? Maybe you do, and I just don't know. I just don't think you hear the conversation about training differently because I am a woman and I've got X amount of levels of this in my body, so I'm going to perform better if I do this sort of training ever so slightly more than this sort of training. But if a man was to do it, they would do it completely different. Or is it you need to be faster, and to get faster you get bigger muscles and become more powerful, for example, and to become more powerful you need to do sets of X amount by X amount. Do you see what I mean? I feel like we're potentially, by not acknowledging the difference between man and woman, we're exposing ourselves to not reaching absolute optimal performance for any of our athletes. You also have to look a bit actually at the coaching as well. There's a disparity between men and women coaches. Only 10% of high-level elite coaches are women. And I'm not saying a female coach is better at coaching a female, but I do think they have access to a viewpoint on how a woman's body works much more than what a man would. And yes, there's a lot of research out there that men can inform themselves on, but from my little experience within sport, it really takes something special for a coach to go and do that. I was shocked when I had a coach that said, oh, by the way, I'm starting to learn about the female body to help with your training programs. Like, that's a rare thing, and it's not a expected thing. So if you had more female coaches, would that training be a bit more openly discussed about actually men and women do need to train a lot more differently than what we're doing right now? And would it just make the whole topic a bit more balanced? Then we also go back to the same argument about money. The way to fully get these answers is to do more research, but research costs a lot of money, and it usually has to come from a private investor who is going to gain from it. And if a man is going to bring in more money for media or sponsorship, the return on the investment is much more secure and bigger, so you're going to continue doing research on men rather than the women. And then we go back to the whole, well, let's just apply that research to a woman, and it not actually fitting very well. So it's difficult because it requires, again, another business scenario to, I guess, go against everything that they're telling them, like, except that they're probably going to get a lower return on investment and have higher risk. Difficult. It's really tricky because I can't sit here and go, do it anyway, because it's business, isn't it? But it would be very interesting to see if someone wanted to donate and invest the money out of goodwill and not actually want anything in return, just to see how much more women could improve if we fully understood what they needed as an athlete for their bodies to be completely optimal, and not, on the whole, training off a one-size-fits-all, male-dominatedly researched methodology. I think you also have to sort of think about, hang on a second, like, why are we not seeing a lot of female athletes talking about this when they can probably see it and know it themselves? And I think half of that is because society does not like women moaning about women issues. We see them as, I think they have a very hard time proving that they can do the sport and that they are very capable of doing it. And if you start saying, oh, I struggle with this, or for instance, my hormones are affecting this, I think if you said that I think 99% of comments that would respond to that would be along the lines of, you're making excuses, you're just a woman and you're just trying to come up with excuses as to why you're not as good. So why would you speak out if that's all the response you're going to get? If you're not going to get a positive response that incites change and development, what's the point of talking about it? I think they'd rather spend time on actually just trying to make themselves better and working it out and doing it quietly and letting results speak for themselves. But how are you going to get change if it's not spoken about? I think my final point on that is the fact that, again, I don't think necessarily the training environment or the way in which a man and women train is necessarily optimal for either one of them. Women suffer because there's not a lot adapted or made entirely for them, but also men suffer because there's so much money riding on them that potentially their safety is compromised, because people are probably willing to do more at their safety expense to push the boundaries that bit too much in order to continue having that funnel of money coming through. The absolute case in point is the NFL. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the Will Smith film Concussion, and it just shows that they were happy to kind of sweep this statistic about brain damage and issues that a lot of their players were facing for the sake of continuing with the brand of the sport that got all the money in, and they were very wary that bringing in change would reduce the finances. So that's not great either. If you're a male in the sport and you feel like you're being used entirely to bring money in, I mean, how much do you really benefit from that? So like I said, I don't think it's perfect for any of them. A male suffers one way, a woman suffers another way. It's just not perfect. It's just not good really for anyone. Maybe we should just suck it up and lump it and just deal with it. We've all got our own issues and get on with it. The more you talk about it, the more you're like, I don't know where to start with this, because men struggle and women are struggling. Then the struggles are completely different, but it doesn't take away from the fact that they're both struggling. I do want to touch very lightly on the fact that obviously men and women are huge differences. The fact that women have children and men can't. Don't tell me otherwise. A man will be able to start their career and finish their career providing there's not some significant change in injury or something, and they will be able to do that. But at some point, a woman will have to choose between her family and her sport. And is that maybe another contributing factor? And whilst, yes, a lot of athletes don't have to have children during their career, a lot of them probably have to think about that. And maybe that doesn't help to the balance between it, is because women athletes on the whole maybe come and go more frequently, so it's harder to build like a fan base around them. And also that when they decide to come back, and it is tricky because they have a much shorter window, I think, to be absolute perfect, because pretty much the time that they would be at their peak, they probably would have maybe be considering bringing their family and priorities having to change, or making decisions to take them out of a season and then having to throw themselves back into it postpartum, and then handling the challenges of motherhood, and then the societal expectations that they should be a mother first and foremost. And if they're traveling around the world for half the year competing, like, who are they as a mother? And I think that is a difference between men and women. A woman would be expected after children to potentially not continue their sport and would be judged for that. Man would be judged if he didn't continue providing for his family. Like, if a man took a season out to care for his partner and his newborn baby, I'm sorry, I don't even want to think the comments. They would not be very complimentary at all, and I think they'd probably be questioning the man's manhood. So I think it's not easy for either of them. Like, they both have to make sacrifices, but why can't men make the decision to have a season out to be a father? Just like, why can't a woman decide after a season to come back and everyone just be okay with that without making questions about how they feel about not being there for their child? Like, a man isn't there if he has to provide, but why is that okay? I get it. It goes back to traditional roles though, and if that's the life you want to leave, brilliant, do it. I'm supportive 100%. I think it just goes back to the societies. We like to say we're very forward thinking and we're changing the views, it's all very modern, but the minute someone does something against the traditional way of thinking, there's always comments made. Again, it's not one suffering more than the other. It's just the fact that we're kind of locked, the genders are kind of locked into the expectations the society has of them. And again, it's just, what do we do to change this? It seems every aspect that we talk about in anywhere where between men and women it's not actually ideal or optimal for either of them. Each side really does suffer and has to deal with negatives surrounding the expectations put on them for that particular topic. So maybe we just need to completely reset this and just go like, this really needs to change, because it's not healthy for either. Why are we constantly in sport putting everything society thinks on the whole like into the the world of sport. And I understand why it's happened, because you're literally men and women, and because they're doing sport doesn't mean that people aren't going to associate that with things they think outside of the world of sport. These people are the absolute best in the world at what they do. Why can't we just accept that and not put all the other rubbish on it? And I think that's kind of what happens. Sport has been subject to all of the stupid opinions and thoughts of society and how we run as a whole, and it's been affected. And I think it could be a very balanced place if we removed all of that. But I mean, we are talking about like unicorn world here, because I just can't see that happening. Like, people cannot separate their opinions for one thing onto another. I think that is literally life. My final point on this gender topic is the growing conversation around transgender athletes. I am all for fairness and equality, and I'd like to think the whole point I've been making throughout these last two podcasts is about understanding that equality and fairness just does not exist in the world of sport, and it definitely could improve. However, I think transgender athletes, where a transgender female is starting to compete against a biological female, is one of the most unfair things you could allow into the world of sport. I think it literally comes on to the point I've just made about societal problems being put into the world of sport, and sort of going, we need to accept and stop judging and discriminating against the transgender community. Yeah, 100% for that. I do not have any response other than, of course. But sport isn't society. Sport is a place where people who are the very best at what they have done, because body has specific genes or makeups that has made them better than their biological counterparts. That's the whole point, is that as a female, they are better than all the other females. If someone has grown up with a higher level of testosterone in their body, their muscle mass would have developed to a much bigger level than a biological female. That doesn't go away. Like, that mass is there, that strength is there. A biological woman will never get to that. So if it goes back to the point of going that actually the whole point of sport is to prove that you are the best version of your category, you can't possibly say that you can compete against someone who has had other influences into their body makeup that has made them effectively better than you. It's a whole new category. It's just not right. I think what I will say, and this is how I view it mostly, there is not a conversation about transgender male competing in the world of men's sport. And the reason behind that is because transgender males did not grow up with a high level of testosterone when their bodies were developing, which means their muscle mass never got to a point where it is on par with a biological male who did have that, even after taking hormones, etc. We don't have that problem, and you don't see transgender males taking first place prizes because of this. And it's because they just can't compete with it. So if that difference is completely acknowledged, and we understand that you won't really have a situation where transgender males are in the top tables of elite male athletes, how can you not apply that same logic when it comes to transgender women in biological women's sports? There is clearly a difference between the two bodies, no matter which gender you are transitioning to, because you identify and you feel who you are deep within. Your soul and your core is not a physical body. No one is saying that they can't do and be that and make the transition and be themselves. I just don't agree with them trying to then say, well, we're now completely the same as a biological woman, so therefore we should compete in the women's sports. It's not fair. I feel quite strongly about this, and I worry that it comes across as like this is my opinion when it comes to just transgender people, and it's not. It's the transgender athletes, and I can kind of understand why they would be like, that's not fair. But not every person on the planet is an elite athlete. The only reason they are is because there is something very special and different about them that has made them to where they've got today. So I could sit here right now saying, it's not fair, I'm not an elite rower, but the truth of the matter is my body just isn't made up to be at that level, and I have to accept that. So just because you're transgender, I don't think it gives you a right to be like, I can start, because physically I can be better than these women, I'm going to go and do it and show that I'm a woman, so therefore I'll be part of it. I don't agree with that. I think it's one of those things where you're going, do you know what? It's a very unfair situation that I'm in, that I was born into the wrong body, but I will ask, if you were born into the right body, would you be dominating the female sports like you are when you were born into the wrong body? I guess there's no way of knowing, but I'm going to say probably not. I don't think, there's no way of proving it, but I just don't think you would. And that's unfair. You're using an advantage that no other woman has got to take the titles away. I don't think it actually produces anything good for that transgender female either, because society won't accept it because of the unfairness. So even though they win, no one will give them the credit that they think they deserve for winning, and the first place will just become like, oh, it's whatever, like no one really, like, of course you're going to get first place, it's not really a contested point. So actually the second place will become the new first place, and you'll almost just be someone competing for the sake of competing to prove that you can, and it not actually like being given any merit. As a transgender female, you have got an unfair advantage, and I do think it is a responsibility on you to accept that and think, I don't belong in the world of biological female sports because my build of my body has just got too much of an advantage to compete. It's not fair because you didn't choose for this life, but I didn't choose to not be an elite athlete and I wanted to. Like, we all have things that wished happened that didn't. And yes, I'm not trying to say that it's the same, and being born in the wrong body is, I can't even imagine what that must feel like. But I don't think it's sports' responsibility to be the point in which you try and prove that you are not what your body is. I don't think it's fair at all. But I do think it always comes back down to the fact that sport is a business. The biggest benefits are only going to come when a lot of money is going to come as a result of it. And until women make as much money as men, I do think that's a big reason as to why there is such a big imbalance between the perception of women in sport and men in sport. I don't think it's easy to be a man or a woman, and if you ask me right now which one I'd rather be, I don't know. I'd probably still choose a woman, actually, because I like playing with my hair. Because that's not appearance based at all, is it? But this is what I'm saying. I think I genuinely couldn't give you an answer, and it would take me a long time to sort of think about what I would prefer, because I genuinely don't know. I don't know if I'd want the pressures and worries and intrusions that men get from sponsorship and media and everything. But then likewise, as a woman, it's very hard having to constantly prove yourself that you are not just something to look at, or your performance is something to be followed and appreciated and actually admired. So it's difficult, isn't it? And I would be really interested to see your thoughts and opinions. Like, would you rather be a man or a woman? I think for every argument there is a response, and I'm yet to decide which side I would rather be on. Thank you so much for listening. This has been the Beyond the Best podcast. You can find me on Spotify and YouTube and on Instagram under the handles of Beyond the Best podcast. Make sure to comment, like, subscribe, listen, give me your thoughts and opinions, send me comments. I love interacting with everybody. I'll speak to you next week.